What's up, Power Painters? This is Taylor Payton of TayPayArt.com and PowerPainters.org coming to you today with another Power Painters tutorial. So in this one, I'm just going to take you through the final part of the Painting with Form series, wherein I start with a dark background and work my way forward, kind of sculpting form from the darker end of the value spectrum to the lighter end of the value spectrum. Now, this is important because, in my opinion, this is one of the easiest ways to start generating form, start generating some of that volume and dimension that you want to see in your work. And this is the most intuitive way that I know of to get it, is to start with something pretty dark and then to use lighter values to pull things forward toward the viewer. Like I said, it's sort of a flat plane we're working with when we're drawing and painting. There's only one. It's a 2D surface, right? So we need to find ways to start showcasing the 3D elements, and that always involves, like I said, light. It involves how objects are reacting to that light source. And in this case, I had sort of a top-down light, and I start with sort of a portrait of a female figure. And this was probably about, I want to say, a little under 35 minutes. It was about 35 minutes when I painted this. You're watching the sped up version because I know you want to get to painting right after you learn some of this stuff. So basically, I just start with some shapes, some really rough, large approximations. You see, I didn't have a drawing this time around, and I usually flip back and forth between sometimes having a very strong drawing and sometimes having a more vague, sort of silhouette-y shape. Because if you have a flat shape, you can always pull form from that as well. Even if you end up with a drawing, usually you're going to do a flat layer underneath it, which turns it into a shape anyway. The drawing is just to get the flow of line so that you have some like an enclosure of space that you can fill in and then begin to sculpt form on. And that's typically how I find myself working, is one of those two ways. And in this case, you're seeing me work the shape way. And this takes a while to get used to. In my opinion, it's a little bit harder to start painting than it is to start drawing, just because we're always so used to making lines because of like creating characters with the ABCs or writing stuff down. It's all line based. You're not really doing things that involve a lot of shading and form. And that's why I really wanted to create this series, because as you proceed to work forward in your art, you want to make sure that as a painter, you're nailing some of those forms. And you see me just kind of working back and forth, pushing and pulling things. It's sort of that dynamic. If you just think about pushing and pulling, if you think about your shadows and your lights, you're going to start seeing form appear to you on the canvas. And when you can start convincing yourself that it's dimensional, then other people are going to start seeing it, and you start hitting that flow state. The flow state in this case involving convincing yourself of the illusion of depth on the picture plane. And that's just kind of the game. And I think that this process is really useful if you already have a fairly reasonable ability to draw, or if you prefer painting more so than drawing, I would keep the shapes very simple so that you are more apt to think about the form rather than correcting shapes all the time. You see me going in here and correcting and refining the shapes a lot because I'm comfortable with this process. And it just takes some repetition, really. This is one way that I started working pretty organically back when I was working in Adobe Flash, of all things. So that's a different program, and it's actually vector based. For those of you who have ever worked in Flash, it's like Illustrator. It's not like Photoshop, which is a roster-based program. I prefer Photoshop because it's more painty, and I enjoy that more than I enjoy like flatter stuff typically. But yeah, I started just laying down shapes, and then I would add brighter colors on top of those shapes to create dimension. And that's when I started to realize how much I actually wanted to paint, because prior it had just been like draw the character, fill in all the shapes, and then add shading with like a really hard edge, which is like cell shading, the kind of stuff you see in animation. But in this case, we want to make sure that we're approaching it in a more of a painty way, because this is the Power Painters channel after all. And when I did that survey for everybody, you guys all said you wanted mostly painting video screen capture. So that's what I'm going to try and focus on. Even though this year for me has been really nice in terms of leveling up my drawing abilities because I was focusing on recreating four more chapters to the beginner drawing course and just making sure I had a stronger basis to paint. It seems that the viewership has spoken in that you want to see more content about painting. So I'm going to try and keep it to that. So something really cool that I just did there was using the dodge tool. That's something I'm very comfortable with at this point as well. For me, the shortcut on the keyboard for the dodge tool is O, and I have it set to highlights at the top there so that you can see it'll start pulling form even easier. And I don't have to worry about like going over to the brightness slider and sliding it up the scale because I have a nice big soft brush for the dodge tool, and that'll start pulling things forward anyway for me. And so it's almost like you're just taking light and a very soft light and sculpting it across the form, just like pulling that volume toward the viewer. And I think that that's a really effective way when you're working in grayscale is to use the dodge tool. If you're working with color, things automatically have more complexity because you're not only worried about your values, you're worried about your hues, you're worried about the base value of the color, you're worried about the temperature of the color, and that is just a lot to juggle. So if you're just starting to create things that you want to see more dimensionality in, you definitely want to err on the side of that and just work in grayscale or work monochromatically in one color and just brighter or darker versions of that color because it will permit you to see things in grayscale for a long time until you'll naturally start to view things in terms of brightness and darkness, in terms of having a lot of form, or in terms of seeming fairly flat. You start to notice where the light tends to fall. The brightest part is typically the highlight, and that will usually be best added at the end, which is like in a very subtle, tiny fashion because if everything is super white and there's lots of juicy highlights, it's usually very stylized or it tends to get overwhelming. So we reserve the brightest parts for the very last part of the process typically. And you want to think about relative and brightness and darkness too. Like, what is the brightest part of the image? What is the thing that has the whitest whites in it? And likewise, what is the darkest part of the image? And then those two values, the brightest part and the darkest part, will set the scale that you're going to be working between. It's like if you're, composing a piece of music, you're like, this is in the key of A minor. And so you know all the chords in A minor, you know all the notes up and down the scale of A minor, you know the intervals, and that means it's going to have a cohesiveness to it. That's why we learn the theory behind all this. I always say, I stole this from a John Mayer talk. You really want the information to express your inspiration. And basically, all that translates to is you want to know your fundamentals and the logic behind what it is you feel inspired to create. Because no matter how inspired you are, until you begin to understand that there's systems in place that will allow you to create certain effects and convince people of what you're doing on the canvas, then you'll end up only being able to express things to a certain degree. And that means that you're not, growing as much as you'd probably like to be. So that's something to consider is just always go back to the fundamentals. And one of the best things that I love to do in terms of the fundamentals is just obsess over one of them because it's going to bring everything else up anyway. So, for example, if you're obsessing about form, just go crazy. Like, really, in your sketchbook, start shading everything. Start to notice where the highlights land on everything. Like, you live in a world of form for a while and just every piece you create, that's the foremost thought in your head. Like, how can I add as much dimensionality as possible? Where am I going to place my shadows so that everything else pops? What is the brightest part of this image? What is the darkest part of this image? Is there a gradient in the shadow? Can I sell some form in there? And you'll start to notice things that you wouldn't notice otherwise because you're going deep as opposed to wide. So that's huge, is to learn a lot about a little and just obsess over one fundamental for a while, because then when you go to color, you start to see form in all the color. And you've unlocked like a new part of your skill tree, a new part of your artist perception. And that's something that really will permit you to ascend very quickly in terms of skill because you'll know the basics so well that whatever you want to express will work a lot better. So I think one thing I might need to obsess over for a while is probably hair, because I only have so many hairstyles in my repertoire, because it's just something I've never paid that much attention to. I always go back to the same sort of hairstyles on my female characters and my male characters just because I just get used to it, you know? And so if you obsess over one thing for a while, you do a ton of studies, you start to inculcate it into your visual library, then it becomes second nature. And then you have hairstyles forever, you know, in terms of any other character you want to create, just because you spent a while studying that one thing, going deep, and then planting that seed so that when it grows up, it's going to be a bigger and stronger part of that whole artistic garden, right? Otherwise, you only have like a really small section. It's like, oh, all the characters have the same hairstyle, or all the things look really flat because they never studied form. So just be sure that you're always going deep on one thing at least. Even if you're drawing like dragons and cars and like forests, make sure that you're focusing on form, or make sure you're focusing on really strong draftsmanship or draftswomanship. It's just take one fundamental and go crazy deep for a couple months. That's one of the biggest things, if nothing else, I want you to take away from this video. So that is about it for this one. Here is the final image. I want to thank you for watching. You would do me a huge favor and visit the description box below. I have a survey down there that you can take to help shape Power Painters in terms of the content I'm going to be putting out. There's also the Painting with Form series available as a premium tutorial, meaning that the videos are longer. I go deeper in terms of allowing you to learn more about form and dimension and how you can better capture that on the picture plane. And yeah, that's about it for this tutorial. I will be seeing you guys in future videos. This has been Taylor Payton of TayPayArt.com and PowerPainters.org, signing off.